There was a box in the freezer that weighed almost nothing, but pulling it out felt like the start of something good. 4 honey buns sealed together under a coat of white sugar glaze, frozen solid, a single sweet brick. Before microwaves lived on every kitchen counter, you slid them into the oven and waited. And then the smell came. Warm yeast and caramelizing sugar drifting through the house. The kind of smell that made a cold morning feel survivable. At its peak, that box sat in freezer cases from Maine to California. Kroger carried it, Winn-Dixie carried it, Safeway, A&P, every regional chain with a frozen food aisle. Morton was there. Families bought it on the weekly grocery run without thinking twice. Parents warmed the buns before the kids were out of bed. A pat of butter on top, still melting when the first bite came. It was not a special occasion food. It was better than that. It was just always there. Then it wasn't. No announcement, no farewell. Just an empty space in the freezer case where the box used to be, and nothing put in its place that tasted anything like it. How does something that lived in so many American kitchens for so many years simply disappear from every shelf in the country and take an entire town's livelihood with it when it goes? This is that story. It started in a church basement, not a factory, not a corporate test kitchen with stainless steel counters and food scientists in white coats. A church basement in Louisville, Kentucky in 1938, where a young man named Harold Morton had recently graduated from college and decided he was going to build a food company from nothing. His first product was not a honey bun. It was not even a frozen food. It was a chicken and noodle dish sold in glass jars made by hand, distributed locally to whoever would carry it. By most measures, it was a modest operation, a one-man business in borrowed space, competing in a market already full of established names. But Harold Morton understood something that a lot of people in the food industry had not yet figured out. American families wanted good food that was ready when they needed it. Not someday, not on weekends when there was time to cook. Every day, before work, after school, on a Tuesday night when nobody had the energy for anything complicated. That instinct would take years to fully develop into a product line. But it was the idea the whole company was built on. The real turning point came after World War II. American life was reorganizing itself at a pace the country had never seen before. Men came back from overseas. Women who had worked through the war years were being asked to return to the home. But the rhythm of daily life had already shifted in ways that could not simply be reversed. Families were moving to the suburbs. Commutes were getting longer. The structure of the American morning, the one that assumed someone had been home since dawn preparing a proper breakfast, was quietly coming apart. Frozen food was the industry's answer to that gap, and Morton was ready. In 1949, Morton Packing Company launched what would become its signature product, the Morton Chicken Pot Pie. Sold under the banner of an old Kentucky recipe, the pot pie came packaged with a mascot, a white-haired, white-suited figure the company called Colonel Morton, a faux Southern gentleman whose face appeared on every box and whose image ran in television commercials across the country. The Colonel was marketing invention, pure and simple. There were no secret Kentucky recipes, no ancestral kitchen hidden somewhere in the bluegrass state. But the warmth the character projected was real enough to work. Families trusted the face on the box. They bought the pot pies, brought them home, and came back for more. 4 years later, in 1953, Morton made the move that would define the company's physical identity for the next half-century. He purchased a frozen food storage and production facility in Crozet, Virginia, a small town tucked into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Albemarle County, about 15 miles west of Charlottesville. The facility had history of its own. The land had once been the center of Virginia's apple export trade, famous for a variety called the Albemarle Pippin that had been prized in London markets since before the Civil War. Now it would become something different, a freezery, a production plant. In time, the largest employer in Albemarle County. The town and the company grew together. Workers from Crozet and the surrounding area filled the plant's shifts. The Morton name became part of the local identity in a way that had nothing to do with advertising. It was where your neighbor worked, where your father worked, where the delivery trucks rolled out before dawn headed for grocery warehouses across the mid-Atlantic in the South. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Morton expanded its product line steadily. Frozen dinners, cream pies, macaroni and cheese, a full range of TV dinner-style entrees. The brand was renamed Morton Frozen Foods and the company relocated its headquarters to New York, signaling its ambitions beyond regional distribution. Colonel Morton still appeared on some packaging. The old Kentucky recipe warmth still colored the brand's identity, but the company was growing into something larger than its church basement origins, and the pressures of that growth were beginning to show. By the early 1970s, something was shifting in the American food landscape. McDonald's had been expanding for a decade. Fast food breakfast was coming. The frozen dinner category, which Morton had helped build from scratch, was becoming more crowded by the year. And the pot pies, the product that had made Morton a household name, were facing real competition for the first time. Morton's response was to lean into something different. Instead of fighting harder for the frozen dinner shelf, the company turned toward frozen bakery and dessert, cream pies, donuts, jelly-filled, Bavarian cream, glazed mini donuts dusted with cinnamon sugar, and then the product that would outlast everything else in the public memory, the honey bun. The Morton Frozen Honey Bun was not a complicated creation. A yeasted sweet dough, baked until golden, coated in a heavy white sugar glaze, then frozen in groups of four, the glaze hardening into a crystalline shell that sealed the buns together in the box. The concept was built around a single idea, a bakery-quality treat that a family could keep in the freezer and heat up whenever they wanted it. No planning required, no skill required, just an oven, a few minutes, and the willingness to wait for something that smelled extraordinary while it warmed. Someone in that test kitchen, or on that production line, or in that crozet plant, got the formula right. The yeast gave the bun a depth that room temperature packaged honey buns never achieved. The glaze, when it softened in the oven heat, went from crystallized white to a slow amber liquid that pooled in the folds of the dough and set again as it cooled. It was the kind of thing that people described for decades afterward in terms that had nothing to do with ingredients and everything to do with the experience of eating it on a specific kind of morning in a specific kitchen at a specific age. That is what Morton had built, not just a product, a moment, a repeatable, reliable, frozen, and reheated moment that millions of American families adopted as their own. The honey bun was in the box was in the freezer, and the freezer was about to become one of the most contested pieces of real estate in American grocery retail. Walk into any major American grocery store in the 1970s and find the frozen food aisle. Not the meat section, not the dairy wall. The frozen food aisle, the one with the glass front cases running the length of the store, fogged with cold, humming with refrigeration units that never stopped. Open one of those cases and the cold hit you in the face before you even saw what was inside. That was part of the experience, the deliberate reach into the cold for something you already knew you wanted. Morton was in there. It had been in there for years. The pot pies had their section. The cream pies had their section. In the frozen bakery, the honey buns, the donuts, the cinnamon rolls, had theirs. The packaging in the 1970s had moved away from the Colonel Morton era into something bolder, brighter, more in keeping with the decade's graphic design sensibility. Wide color bands, large product photography, the glazed bun front and center on the box in a photograph that managed to make frozen food look like it had just come out of a neighborhood bakery oven, which was in fact exactly what the 1971 advertising campaign promised, as fresh as your neighborhood bakeries. That was not an accident. It was a precise piece of positioning in a market that was becoming crowded, aimed at a consumer who was increasingly pressed for time, but had not yet given up entirely on the idea that breakfast could be something worth eating. The box itself was part of the ritual. 4 buns visible through the cellophane window, glazed white, pressed together in their frozen formation. A child could carry it. It was light enough that a kid reaching into the freezer case could pull it out with one hand, carry it to the cart, and feel like they had contributed something to the family grocery run. There was no mystique to it, no premium price that made it feel out of reach. It was just there, affordable and familiar, and it went into the cart the same way a dozen other things did, without discussion, without debate, because everyone already knew it was coming home. What happened next was the part that people remembered for the rest of their lives. The oven preheated. The buns went in still frozen, still locked together in their brick formation. And then the smell started. First faint, then filling the kitchen completely, warm yeast and caramelizing sugar, climbing through the house in a way that announced something good was happening and would be ready soon. This was before most American households owned a microwave. The oven was the only option, and the oven took its time, and the waiting was part of it. The anticipation built with the smell. By the time the timer went off, the kitchen felt different than it had 15 minutes earlier. The buns came out separated now, the glaze softened and translucent, amber where it had pooled thickest in the creases of the dough. The standard move, documented in fan memories across decades in geography, from Virginia to Arkansas to New Hampshire, was the butter. A full pat placed directly on top of the bun the moment it came out of the oven, before it had time to cool. The butter hit the warm glaze and began dissolving immediately, running down the sides of the bun in thin golden rivulets, soaking into the dough at the edges. The first bite came too soon, always. Too hot, the glaze still liquid enough to run. But no one waited. That was also part of it. What was it about that warm glazed bun on a winter morning that made the whole day feel like it might turn out all right? The memories attached to Morton Honey Buns are not vague. They are specific in the way that food memories from childhood always are. Precise about the time of day, the room, the other person present. A father who worked overnight, shifts coming home at 5 in the morning, warming honey buns in the oven, and a child waking up to the smell and padding into the kitchen to sit with him before the rest of the house stirred. A grandmother who kept a box in the freezer as a standing treat. The kind of thing grandchildren associated with her kitchen the way they associated other grandmothers, kitchens with particular smells or particular plates. A Christmas morning tradition that held for years. The honey buns going into the oven before the presents came out, the smell threading through the house alongside pine and cold air from the door being opened and closed. These were not wealthy households by and large. The Morton customer was not buying luxury food. The Morton customer was buying reliable pleasure at a price that made sense, and finding in that transaction something that functioned like a small act of care. Putting a box of Morton Honey Buns in the freezer on Sunday meant there was something good waiting for the family on any morning of the week. That is not a small thing. In a household running on tight margins and tighter schedules, the knowledge that a warm, good-tasting breakfast was 20 minutes away, always without fail, was worth something real. For the workers inside the Crochet plant and the regional sales representatives driving those boxes to grocery warehouses across the Mid-Atlantic and the South, the golden era felt like permanence. The plant hummed, the freezer trucks rolled, the orders came in and the orders were filled. Albemarle County had grown its economy around this facility, and the facility showed no signs of slowing. The Morton salesman who came to town was welcomed. His products moved. His accounts reordered. It felt like something that would simply continue. It felt, in the way that good things always feel when they are at their height, like it had always been this way and always would be. It would not. By the early 1970s, Morton Frozen Foods was not a regional favorite anymore. It was a national brand with national distribution, its trucks moving product into grocery warehouses from the Atlantic seaboard to the Midwest, its boxes appearing in freezer cases at Kroger, Winn-Dixie, Safeway, A&P, and every mid-size regional chain that had built out a frozen food section in the previous decade. The scaling had happened gradually enough that most shoppers never noticed it happening at all. Morton was simply there, had always seemed to be there. The way a brand achieves true shelf permanence, not through a single moment of arrival, but through years of quiet, consistent presence. The production infrastructure behind that presence was anchored at 2 facilities. The Crozet, Virginia plant handled the majority of the frozen bakery line. The honey buns, the donuts, the cinnamon rolls, the cream pies. The Webster City, Iowa facility supplemented production and handled distribution into the central and western markets. Between the 2 plants, Morton could move volume at a scale that matched the demand its brand recognition had built. The freezer trucks left before dawn. The warehouse orders were filled on schedule. The system worked. What made the frozen bakery line different from the pot pies, the product that had originally built the brand, was where it lived in the store. Pot pies occupied a utilitarian section of the freezer case, shelved alongside other convenience dinner options in a category defined by practicality. The frozen bakery products occupied different real estate, both physically and emotionally. They sat near the frozen breakfast items, adjacent to the orange juice concentrates and the breakfast sausages, in a section of the store that carried a different kind of promise. Dinner was obligation. Breakfast, or the sweet treat that accompanied it, was something closer to pleasure. Morton understood that distinction, and the honey buns were positioned accordingly. The factory outlet stores near the production plants were a piece of the distribution story that no corporate marketing plan had designed, but that built some of the fiercest local loyalty the brand ever generated. Near Russellville, Arkansas, where Morton operated a production facility, families could walk in on a Wednesday and buy bulk boxes of honey buns, donuts, and pot pies at prices that made stocking the freezer feel like a genuine windfall. $1 or $2 per box at 1976 prices, pot pies 12 to a box, honey buns and donuts in quantities that filled the freezer shelf. These outlet store customers did not buy Morton because of television advertising. They bought it because they had tasted it, because the price was right, and because the plant down the road was part of their community in a way that no other food brand could claim. The companion products that surrounded the honey bun in the frozen bakery line were worth noting because they illustrated the range Morton was attempting to cover. Jelly donuts, Bavarian cream donuts, glazed mini donuts dusted with cinnamon sugar, spice donuts, cinnamon rolls, each one built on the same core concept as the honey bun, a bakery-quality frozen product designed for the oven, intended to deliver something that tasted made rather than manufactured. The line gave a family options without requiring them to choose a different brand. Once Morton was trusted, the full bakery section of that freezer case was Morton's to own. The 1971 print advertising campaign captured the brand at this moment of confident expansion. Magazine ads promoted the frozen baked goods line with photography that emphasized warmth and freshness, the honey buns shot in soft light, the glaze catching the camera, the slogan running clean across the bottom. As fresh as your neighborhood bakeries. It was an audacious claim for a frozen product, and it worked precisely because the product was good enough to support it. Morton was not asking shoppers to lower their expectations. It was asking them to raise their expectations of what frozen food could deliver. But underneath the confidence of that expansion, the structural conditions that would eventually threaten everything Morton had built were already taking shape. The brand was growing, but it was growing inside a corporate structure that was changing around it. Morton Packing Company had long since ceased to be a founder-led independent business. It had become a division of ITT Continental Baking Company, the corporate parent that also owned Hostess. The Continental Baking connection put Morton inside one of the largest baked goods operations in the country, which provided production resources and distribution infrastructure. But it also meant that Morton's identity, the warmth of the Colonel Morton character, the old Kentucky recipe positioning, the small company authenticity that had always been part of the brand's appeal, now had to survive inside a conglomerate that had not built those things and did not particularly need them. The Colonel Morton character was already fading from packaging by this period. The white-suited Southern gentleman who had anchored the brand's visual identity through the 1950s and 1960s was quietly retired, replaced by more generic frozen food design language. Most shoppers did not register the change consciously, but something in the brand's personality had been removed and nothing had been put in its place. The honey buns still tasted exactly the same. The box still went into the freezer. The oven still filled the kitchen with that smell on cold mornings. For the families buying Morton every week, nothing had changed. But in December of 1980, a wire service dispatch moved out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the food industry paid attention, even if most shoppers did not. Morton Frozen Foods division of ITT Continental Baking Company had been sold. The buyer was Del Monte Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of R.J. Reynolds Industries, the tobacco and consumer goods conglomerate headquartered in Winston-Salem. A honey bun brand built in a church basement in Louisville by a man who believed American families deserved something good to eat, now belonged to a tobacco company. The box and the freezer looked the same, but the hands holding the company had changed completely. There is a particular kind of American brand that achieves something beyond market share. It stops being a product that people choose and becomes a product that people simply expect to find. On the shelf, in the freezer, in the cabinet, the way they expect the lights to come on when they flip the switch. No decision required, no comparison shopping, just the automatic reach, the familiar box, the transaction completed before conscious thought caught up with the hand, already in the freezer case. Morton Frozen Honey Buns had become that kind of brand. Through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the honey buns sat in freezer cases across the country with the quiet authority of something that had earned its place and intended to keep it. Kroger customers in Georgia reached for them the same way Safeway customers in Maryland did. The box was recognizable from 10 feet away. The warm photography, the glazed bun centered on the front panel, the Morton name across the top in the lettering that generations of shoppers had grown up reading. It was not a premium product and had never pretended to be. It was something better than premium. It was dependable. The working parent household of the 1970s was under pressures that the previous generation had not faced at the same scale. Dual income families were no longer an exception. They were becoming the norm. The morning routine in a house where both parents worked a full day was a logistical problem that needed solving before 7 a.m. every single day without fail. Breakfast could not require 30 minutes of active cooking. It could not depend on someone having planned ahead the night before. It needed to be something that was simply already there, waiting, requiring nothing more than an oven and a few minutes of patience. Morton Honey Buns solved that problem in a way that felt like more than a solution. They felt like a choice. Pulling that box from the freezer and sliding the buns into the oven was not the same as opening a can of something or pouring cereal into a bowl. There was warmth involved. Literal warmth. The oven heating, the smell building. That elevated the transaction above pure convenience into something that resembled, however briefly, the experience of having made something for the people you were feeding. That distinction mattered to parents who were already measuring their available time in minutes and looking for any moment that felt like genuine care rather than managed logistics. For the latchkey kids who let themselves into empty houses after school in the 1970s and early 1980s, Morton Honey Buns occupied a different but equally important position. The freezer box was something a 12-year-old could manage alone. The oven instructions were simple. The result was warm and sweet and ready in under 20 minutes, which was faster than most alternatives and better tasting than all of them. In a decade when the phrase latchkey kid entered the American vocabulary as a description of a generation managing more independence than previous generations had been asked to manage at the same age, the existence of something this reliable and this good in the freezer was not a trivial comfort. When a brand lives in your house for 20 years, feeds your children, fills your kitchen with a smell that means the morning is starting right, costs little enough that it never requires a second thought. At what point does it stop being a product and become part of how your family works? The answer for hundreds of thousands of American households was that Morton had crossed that line long before anyone thought to ask the question. The cultural footprint of the brand extended beyond the home freezer. The 1969 Look magazine advertisement showed Morton packaging at its most visually confident, a period when the brand's graphic design matched its market position, assured and unhurried, the product of a company that knew what it was and did not feel the need to prove it. The 1971 bakery campaign pushed further, placing the frozen honey bun in direct comparison with fresh bakery products and winning that comparison in the minds of consumers who had tasted both. The factory outlet stores near the Crozet and Russellville plants had built communities of loyal buyers who did not merely purchase Morton products. They stocked up. They planned around availability. They drove out of their way on Wednesdays to fill the trunk. Inside the Crozet plant, the peak years felt like something that would not end. Albemarle County's largest employer ran multiple shifts. The production lines moved. The freezer trucks loaded in the pre-dawn dark and headed out to distribution centers across the region. Workers who had spent their careers inside that plant, purchasing agents, line supervisors, thrift store managers, remembered the rhythm of those years as a kind of steady music. The hum of the refrigeration equipment, the smell of baking dough drifting through the facility, the knowledge that what they were making was going directly into American kitchens and being received there with something close to gratitude. The sales representatives who carried Morton products into grocery accounts remembered the welcome they received. The Morton salesman who came to town was not just a vendor making a pitch. He was delivering something that store managers knew their customers wanted, that moved reliably off the shelf, that generated reorders without requiring promotional pressure. An easy account, a trusted brand, the kind of relationship between a sales rep and a buyer that gets built over years of consistent product and consistent demand. It felt permanent. It felt like the natural condition of things rather than a moment that would eventually pass. But in the boardrooms where Morton's future was being decided, the product in the freezer case and the loyalty it had earned were not the primary subject of conversation. The subject was portfolio management, redundancy, efficiency, the cold mathematics of a conglomerate deciding what it needed and what it did not. The families buying the honey buns had no way of knowing that conversation was already underway. They would find out the way people always find out when a brand they love is in trouble, not through an announcement, but through an absence. A shelf that looked slightly different, a box that was not where it had always been, a reach into the freezer case that came back empty. That moment was still a few years away, but it was coming. The December 1980 sale of Morton Frozen Foods to Del Monte Corporation did not make front-page news. It was a wire service item, a few paragraphs in the business section, the kind of corporate transaction that registered as significant inside the food industry and as nothing at all to the families who kept a box of honey buns in their freezer. Del Monte was a known name. Canned vegetables, fruit cocktail, the yellow label that had lived in American pantries for decades. R.J. Reynolds, the parent company behind the purchase, was one of the most powerful consumer goods conglomerates in the country. On paper, Morton was moving into a larger and better resourced home. What the transaction actually represented was something the balance sheet could not capture. Morton Frozen Foods was now a line item inside a tobacco and consumer goods empire that had not built the brand, had not grown up with it, and had no particular emotional stake in what made it work. Del Monte needed Morton's frozen food distribution footprint and its grocery freezer case relationships. It did not need Colonel Morton. It did not need the old Kentucky recipe warmth. It did not need the specific personality that Harold Morton had constructed from a church basement in Louisville across 4 decades of building something people genuinely loved. Those things were already fading before the ink dried on the 1980 sale. The Colonel Morton character, the white-suited Kentucky gentleman who had anchored the brand's visual identity through its founding era, had been quietly retired during the Continental baking years. The packaging had shifted away from the warmth of the original design toward the more generic visual language of large-scale frozen food production. Nothing about the change was announced. Nothing was explained to the consumer. The box on the shelf simply looked a little different than it had a few years before, and most shoppers reaching for it out of habit did not consciously register the difference. But something had been removed. The personality that made Morton feel like a company rather than a brand, the sense that someone specific had made these decisions, had cared about these products in a particular way, was no longer visible in the packaging, no longer present in the advertising, no longer reinforced by the face of the Colonel looking back from the freezer case door. The honey bun still tasted the same. That mattered enormously, and for a time it was enough. Through the early 1980s, the product held. Families who had been buying Morton for a decade kept buying it. The freezer case relationships that Morton's sales force had built over years remained intact. The reorders came in. The Crozet plant kept running. From the outside, from the grocery store aisle, from the family kitchen, nothing had changed in any way that was visible or felt. What was changing was happening at a level most shoppers could not see and would not think to look for. Inside Del Monte, and then inside the broader R.J. Reynolds portfolio, Morton was being evaluated not as a brand with a history and a loyal consumer base, but as an asset with a return profile. The frozen bakery category, honey buns, donuts, cinnamon rolls, was not a high-margin business. It required freezer infrastructure at the retail level, cold chain logistics throughout distribution, and production facilities that were expensive to operate and maintain. The pot pies that had originally made Morton famous were facing competition from Banquet and other frozen dinner brands that were investing more heavily in the category. The bakery line was well-loved but not dominant. It was, in the language that conglomerates use when they are preparing to do something, underperforming its potential. Meanwhile, the American breakfast landscape was transforming in ways that directly threatened everything Morton had built its morning business on. McDonald's had launched its breakfast menu nationally in 1977, and the results had exceeded every projection the company had made. By the early 1980s, the Egg McMuffin was a cultural fixture. Hardee's followed. Burger King followed. The drive-through breakfast was not a novelty anymore. It was a category, and it was growing at a rate that the frozen food industry could not match. The working parent who once relied on the Morton Honey Bun in the home freezer now had an alternative that required no preheating, no waiting, no oven at all, just a window and a paper bag handed through it. How many times can a brand change hands before the people who built it and the people who loved it are no longer part of the conversation? The answer in Morton's case was already becoming clear. In 1986, Del Monte sold Morton Frozen Foods again. The new owner was ConAgra Foods, the Omaha-based agricultural and food processing conglomerate that was in the middle of an aggressive acquisition campaign, assembling one of the largest portfolios of American food brands ever consolidated under a single corporate roof. ConAgra already owned Banquet Frozen Foods, the direct competitor to Morton's frozen dinner line. It owned a range of other frozen and packaged food brands that overlapped with Morton's product categories in ways that any rational portfolio manager could see immediately. Morton was now inside a company that already had something very much like Morton. The redundancy that would eventually justify the brand's elimination was visible from the first day of ConAgra's ownership. No one in the grocery aisle knew it yet. No one buying honey buns on a Thursday morning had any reason to think the box they were reaching for was anything other than permanent. But in the offices where these decisions were made, the question was already being asked, not loudly, not urgently, but asked nonetheless. What exactly does Morton do for ConAgra that Banquet does not already do? It was the wrong question. It was a question that looked at a brand and saw only what it overlapped with, not what it had built, not what it meant to the people who had made it part of their lives. But it was the question being asked, and in corporate portfolio logic, once that question is on the table, the answer tends to move in only one direction. The honey buns were still in the freezer case. The families were still buying them. The Crozet plant was still running its shifts. But the clock, though no one had announced it, had started. Word count, 1,043 words. ConAgra Foods in the late 1980s was not a company that acquired brands because it loved them. It acquired brands because it loved scale. The Omaha-based conglomerate was executing one of the most ambitious consolidation strategies in American food industry history, assembling a portfolio that would eventually include hundreds of individual brands across nearly every category of grocery retail. The logic was straightforward and, from a pure business standpoint, not unreasonable. Buy enough brands, consolidate production, eliminate redundancy, reduce overhead, and extract margin from the combined operation that no individual brand could generate on its own. Morton Frozen Foods entered that machine in 1986. The immediate problem ConAgra faced was one it had created for itself. Banquet Frozen Foods, one of ConAgra's core holdings, occupied essentially the same consumer position as Morton. Affordable frozen meals and frozen bakery items sold in the same freezer cases to the same demographic at comparable price points. From a portfolio management perspective, running two brands in direct competition with each other inside the same company was inefficient. Resources spent marketing Morton were resources not being spent reinforcing Banquet. Production capacity used for Morton Honey Buns was production capacity that could theoretically be redirected toward higher margin ConAgra priorities. The internal calculus was not complicated. It just happened to be devastating for everyone who had spent their working life making Morton products and for everyone who had spent their family life eating them. What followed was not a dramatic corporate execution. There was no single meeting where someone drew a line through the Morton name and announced that it was finished. The elimination of the brand was more gradual than that. and in some ways more cruel, a slow withdrawal of the resources and attention that a brand needs to survive in a competitive retail environment, carried out over the better part of a decade while the product remained on shelves and consumers continued buying it, without any indication that what they were purchasing was already being phased out. Marketing investment in Morton contracted. The advertising that had once placed Morton Honey Bun photography in national magazines and supported the brand's as fresh as your neighborhood bakeries positioning quietly stopped. Without advertising support, retail buyers had less reason to prioritize Morton shelf placement over competing products that were actively being promoted. Shelf space in a grocery freezer case is not held on sentiment. It is held on velocity, how fast the product moves. And velocity is influenced by advertising, by promotional pricing, by the presence of the brand in the consumer's mind when they walk down the aisle. Strip away the advertising and the promotional support, and velocity slows. When velocity slows, shelf space contracts. When shelf space contracts, the product becomes harder to find, which reduces velocity further. It is a spiral, and once it starts, it is very difficult to reverse without a deliberate decision to reverse it. Conagra did not make that decision. Instead, through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Morton's freezer case presence began a quiet contraction. Not everywhere at once, not in a way that any individual shopper could have mapped or documented, but region by region, chain by chain, the reorders slowed and the shelf facings narrowed. In some markets, Morton disappeared from certain stores years before it disappeared from others, which created the confusing geography of the brand's final years. A product that was simultaneously being mourned as gone by consumers in one part of the country, while still being purchased routinely by consumers 2 states away. The regional sales representatives who carried the Morton line through this period lived the contraction in real time. Accounts that had reordered automatically for years began asking questions. Why wasn't there any advertising support? Why had the promotional allowances dried up? If Conagra wasn't going to invest in the brand, why should a store manager give premium freezer case real estate to a product that wasn't being driven to that shelf by any external marketing? These were fair questions. They did not have good answers. The sales reps who had built their careers on the Morton relationship found themselves defending a brand that the company that owned it had effectively stopped defending. Who exactly was supposed to speak for the people who made this and for the people who ate it when the spreadsheet said it was time to go? Inside the Crozet plant, the slowdown was felt before it was officially acknowledged. Production schedules that had once run at capacity began to ease. Orders that would have filled multiple shifts began to fit into fewer. Workers who had spent 10, 15, 20 years inside that facility, people whose parents had worked there before them, whose children had grown up expecting to work there after them, began to sense something that plant management was not yet saying out loud. The rhythm that had defined the facility since 1953 was changing. The hum was the same, the equipment was the same, but the pace was different. And people who had spent their working lives inside a production environment know the difference between a temporary slow period and something structural. The broader food industry context made the situation worse. The 1990s brought a wave of consumer interest in fresh food that directly challenged the frozen convenience category Morton had helped build. Fresh and fast casual dining was expanding rapidly into markets that had previously been served entirely by frozen food and quick service restaurants. Supermarkets themselves were investing in in-store bakeries, actual bakeries with actual ovens, producing actual fresh product on the premises that competed directly with the promise Morton had made since 1971, that a frozen honey bun, warmed properly, could deliver something as good as what a neighborhood bakery produced. When the supermarket had its own bakery operating 30 feet from the frozen food aisle, that promise became harder to sustain. The microwave had also fundamentally changed the relationship between American consumers and frozen food in ways that did not favor Morton's bakery line. By the late 1980s, microwave ovens were in the majority of American homes. The convenience food industry had reorganized itself around microwave preparation, shorter cook times, packaging designed for microwave use, products formulated to perform acceptably under microwave heat. Morton Honey Buns were not formulated for the microwave. They were an oven product, built for a slower preparation ritual that the microwave era had largely made obsolete. A consumer who microwaved a Morton honey bun got something edible but diminished, the glaze turning watery rather than amber, the dough losing the slight exterior crispness that the oven produced. The product that had been defined by its preparation ritual was now being prepared in a way that undermined the very qualities that made it worth eating. Conagra's response to all of this was not to invest in reformulation, not to adapt the product for microwave preparation, not to launch a campaign that reminded consumers why the oven ritual was worth the extra 15 minutes. Conagra's response was to continue the quiet withdrawal that had been underway since the late 1980s, allow the brand to decline at whatever pace the market dictated, and direct its frozen food investment toward the banquet line and other higher priority portfolio holdings. The people who had built Morton and the people who had spent careers making its products in Crozet, Virginia, were watching this happen from inside it. Former employees documented the period in terms that carry the specific frustration of people who understood exactly what was being lost and had no mechanism to stop it. The plant was still operating. The product was still being made. The honey buns were still going into boxes. The boxes were still going into trucks. The trucks were still making deliveries to the warehouses that supplied the stores where fewer and fewer shoppers were finding them on the shelf. It was not a collapse. It was an erasure. Methodical, corporate, carried out without malice and without particular awareness of what was being destroyed, by people in offices in Omaha who had never warmed a Morton honey bun in an oven on a cold morning and had no framework for understanding why that experience had mattered to so many people for so long. The Crozet plant ran its last production in the final years of the 1990s. The shutdown of the facility, the place that had been Albemarle County's largest employer for decades, that had opened on August 1st, 1953, that had outlasted Harold Morton himself and 4 different corporate owners, was completed in 2000. The last box had already left the building. The last truck had already pulled away. And in grocery stores across the country, in freezer cases that had held Morton products for 30 years, something else had already moved into the space. Something that was not Morton. Something that would never be Morton. Something that filled the shelf and left the memory exactly where it had always been. In the hands, in the kitchens, and the cold winter mornings of everyone who had ever reached for that box and found it there. It did not happen the way a discontinuation is supposed to happen. There was no press release, no full-page newspaper notice, no letter from Conagra to the millions of households that had kept a Morton box in the freezer for the better part of 3 decades, explaining that the product they had relied on was being removed from the market and would not be coming back. The end of Morton Frozen Honey Buns was not an announcement. It was an absence, a gradual, geographically uneven, maddeningly quiet withdrawal from the shelves that left consumers confused rather than informed, reaching for something that was no longer there, and wondering initially if they were simply looking in the wrong place. This is how it felt from inside a grocery store in the mid to late 1990s. You walked the frozen food aisle on a Tuesday evening the way you had walked it hundreds of times before. You knew where Morton was. You had reached for it in that exact location so many times that your hand moved toward the case before your eyes had fully scanned the shelf. And then your hand found something else, a different brand, a store brand frozen pastry in generic packaging, an empty space where a box had been slid out and not replaced. You looked again. You checked the adjacent doors. You may have flagged down a store employee who checked a clipboard and told you they were out of stock, or that it had been discontinued, or, most commonly, that they simply did not know. You went home without it. You came back the following week. It was not there. That was the experience. Not a single moment of loss, but a repeated accumulating confirmation that something had changed and was not going to change back. The product did not disappear everywhere at once. In some markets, it was gone from certain chains years before it vanished from others. A shopper in one part of Virginia might have lost Morton Honey Buns from their local Kroger in 1994, while a shopper 2 hours away in a different market could still find them in 1997. The regional patchwork of the brand's final years meant that consumers had no shared moment of loss, no collective experience that might have generated the kind of immediate public reaction that a single national discontinuation announcement would have produced. Instead, the grief was individual, private, and delayed. People lost Morton on their own schedules, in their own stores, without knowing that the same thing was happening to everyone else who had ever loved the product. By the time the internet began connecting those individual experiences into a shared community of loss, the brand had already been gone for years in most markets, and the Crozet plant that had made it had already been closed. The last boxes moved through the distribution chain without ceremony. There was no documented final lot, no collector who bought the last case off a warehouse shelf and preserved the box for posterity the way some discontinued brands generate. The product simply ran out, store by store, region by region, and was not replenished. What remained on shelves in the final weeks of availability sold through at regular price, no clearance markdown, no signal to consumers that what they were buying was the last of something. People bought the last Morton Honey Buns they would ever buy without knowing they were the last ones. They ate them on ordinary mornings, in ordinary kitchens, without ceremony or awareness that the ritual they were performing would not be repeatable. That specific quality of the loss, the absence of a goodbye, is what the Morton community has returned to most consistently in the decades since the brand disappeared. Not the anger at Conagra, though that is present. Not the frustration with the business logic that made the elimination seem rational to the people who executed it. What people return to is the simple fact that something was taken without being acknowledged as taken. The honey buns were there, and then they were not, and no one who made the decision to remove them ever stood in front of the people who loved them and said, "We know what this meant to you, and we are sorry it is gone." That silence has lasted 25 years. It has not made the memory smaller. If anything, it has made it more concentrated, preserved in the specific details that people carry when they have no other form of closure. The weight of the box, the glaze on the 4 frozen buns pressed together, the smell of the oven, the butter dissolving into the warm sugar, these details have not faded. They have sharpened, the way sensory memories do when there is no possibility of refreshing them through repetition. What fills the space on a shelf where something people genuinely loved used to be? The answer in Morton's case was banquet, in-store brands. And the slow expansion of the ambient packaged honey bun category, Little Debbie, Hostess, the individually wrapped room temperature products that had always existed alongside Morton in grocery stores but had never competed with it in any meaningful sensory sense. These products were not the same. They had never claimed to be the same. They occupied the same general category designation, sweet baked goods, while delivering a fundamentally different experience. A room temperature packaged honey bun requires no oven, no waiting, no ritual. It is immediate and convenient and thoroughly unlike the experience of pulling a warm, glaze-softened, butter-topped Morton honey bun from the oven on a cold morning. The people who had grown up on Morton knew the difference instantly. They tried the alternatives. They documented their attempts in the comment threads and fan forums that began accumulating around the brand's memory in the early 2000s, as the internet gave scattered individuals a place to discover that their private grief was shared. The testimony across those threads is remarkably consistent. Nothing was the same. Little Debbie was too sweet in the wrong way. The room temperature products lacked the yeast depth that defined Morton's flavor. Warming a packaged ambient honey bun in the microwave or oven produced something that approximated the texture without approximating the taste. The formula was gone, and without the formula, the ritual could be performed but not completed. Some consumers found partial solutions. Pet Ritz brand frozen honey buns appeared in select regional grocery chains in New England and were cited in multiple fan communities as the closest available substitute. A frozen product, prepared the same way, delivering something in the vicinity of the original experience. But Pet Ritz was regional, not national, and finding it required either proximity to the right stores or the kind of deliberate searching that most people do not sustain indefinitely for a breakfast treat. The discovery of the Krispy Kreme approximation, a glazed original Krispy Kreme donut microwaved for 10 seconds, spread through the fan community as a widely validated workaround, testament to how precisely people remembered the original product's qualities and how seriously they took the project of reconstructing them. On Brandland USA, The brand history and nostalgia site that published some of the earliest long-form documentation of Morton's history, the Honey Bun page became one of the most consistently trafficked pieces on the site. The comment section accumulated over years into a document of collective memory that reads like nothing so much as letters to something that cannot write back. People describing Christmas morning traditions, people describing fathers and grandmothers, and kitchens that no longer exist. People asking, with a directness that makes the corporate silence on the other end feel even louder, why no one had brought it back. Why no one at Conagra had looked at the depth of this feeling and decided it was worth something. The Morton Frozen Foods Facebook page, established by the revival group that formed around 2015, accumulated followers steadily, former employees, their children and grandchildren, consumers who had not tasted a Morton honey bun in 20 years and had not stopped thinking about it. The iPetitions campaign, targeting 1,000 signatures as a threshold for beginning direct dialogue with Conagra executives, filled slowly and persistently, driven not by a viral moment, but by the steady accumulation of people who searched for Morton on the internet, found the petition, and signed it because the act of signing felt like the only available response to a loss that had never been formally acknowledged. Conagra did not respond publicly. The brand remained discontinued. The Crozet plant remained closed. The space in the freezer case where Morton had lived for 30 years remained occupied by something else. In Crozet, Virginia, the closure of the plant that had been the community's largest employer for nearly 50 years left a mark that outlasted the brand itself. The facility that had opened on August 1st, 1953, that had run shifts through the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy assassination, in the moon landing and Watergate in the Reagan years and the first Gulf War, was gone. The workers who had spent careers inside it dispersed. The institutional knowledge of how to make a Morton honey bun, the specific formula, the specific process, the specific combination of yeast and dough and glaze that had produced something millions of people remembered with a precision that most foods never achieve, dispersed with them. No one wrote it down in a form that survived the closure. No one preserved the recipe in a way that allowed reconstruction. The formula existed in the memories of the people who had made it, and those people had moved on to other work, other lives, other towns, carrying with them the knowledge of something that could not now be rebuilt, even if the will to rebuild it existed, which is perhaps the most honest measure of what was lost when Morton Frozen Foods went dark in 2000. Not a SKU removed from a product catalog, not a line item eliminated from a portfolio review, a specific unrepeatable knowledge of how to make something that people loved, held in human hands, transferred through human practice, and extinguished when the plant that housed it closed its doors for the last time and the truck stopped coming. The shelf in the frozen food aisle filled in. It always does. The cases hummed on. The fluorescent lights stayed on above the glass doors, illuminating products that were perfectly adequate and entirely beside the point for anyone who remembered what used to be there. Something real had been in that freezer case, something earned over decades, built from a church basement in Louisville, carried through a Virginia mountain town, handed down through families who never thought of it as anything as small as a food product. It was gone now, and the space it left was exactly the shape of itself, specific, irreplaceable, and completely invisible to anyone who had never known it was there. The freezer case moved on the way freezer cases always do. The glass doors stayed cold. The fluorescent light inside the case kept running. And the space where Morton Honey Buns had lived for 30 years filled in with products that had nothing to do with what had been there before. Store brands in generic packaging, banquet items that Conagra was actively promoting, ambient pastry products that had migrated from the room temperature aisle into the frozen section without ever understanding what the frozen section had once meant to the people who shopped it. For the consumers who had lost Morton, the years immediately following the brand's disappearance were a period of searching that most of them conducted alone, without knowing that thousands of other people were conducting the same search and the same frustration. They tried things. They reported back to whoever would listen, a spouse, a sibling, eventually an internet forum, that none of it was right. Little Debbie honey buns were too sweet and too flat, lacking the yeast structure that had given Morton's product its particular depth. Warming a packaged ambient bun in the oven produced something edible but hollow, a rough approximation of the right shape without the right interior. The room temperature category had been engineered for shelf stability and immediate consumption, not for the oven ritual that had defined the Morton experience, and no amount of reheating could reverse that fundamental difference in what the product had been built to do. The closest thing anyone found was Pet Ritz, a regional frozen honey bun brand available in select New England grocery chains. Pet Ritz was a frozen product, prepared the same way, requiring the same oven, delivering something in the general vicinity of what Morton had been. Fans who found it documented the discovery in online communities with the specific excitement of people who had been looking for something for years and had finally located a partial answer. It was not Morton. No one claimed it was Morton, but it was frozen, it was yeast-based, it warmed correctly, and it reminded people of what the category was supposed to feel like. For consumers in Bedford and Londonderry, New Hampshire, where Pet Ritz appeared at Vista Foods and Demoulas Market Basket, it became a genuine substitute. Imperfect, regional, but real. The Krispy Kreme solution spread further and lasted longer. Someone in the fan community, the specific origin is undocumented, the discovery almost certainly made independently by multiple people, worked out that a Krispy Kreme original glazed donut microwaved for approximately 10 seconds produced a texture and warmth that recalled Morton Honey Buns with surprising accuracy. The glaze softened the same way. The dough yielded with a similar give. The experience of eating it warm, with butter, approximated the ritual closely enough that the workaround circulated widely and held up under repetition. It was not the same product. It was not even the same format, but it satisfied the specific sensory memory in a way that nothing else in the available market had managed. And that specificity, the fact that it worked on the memory rather than just on the appetite, said something precise about how exactly and how durably people remembered what Morton had been. The organized effort to bring Morton back formally began taking shape around 2015, more than 15 years after the brand had disappeared. The group that emerged was not a casual social media campaign. It was anchored by people with direct personal connections to the brand. Former Morton employees, their children, their grandchildren, and in at least one documented case, a direct descendant of the company's co-founding family. Sean Huvel, a historian and faculty member at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, is the great-grandson of Gene D. Patton, who helped Harold Morton establish the Morton Packing Company in 1938 and went on to serve as the company's vice president of production and a member of its board of directors. Huvel's grandfather, Gene Liberati, was also a longtime Morton executive. The revival effort was not sentiment in search of a strategy. It was family history in search of a second chapter. The group's plan was structured in two phases. The first was documentation and visibility, establishing a Facebook presence, generating media coverage through regional outlets like the Crozet Gazette, building a public record of Morton's history that could support the case for revival. The second phase was direct engagement with Conagra, a lobbying campaign backed by documented consumer demand, proposing a trial reintroduction of the honey buns and mini donuts in selected markets to test whether the appetite for the brand translated into actual purchasing behavior. The iPetitions campaign set 1,000 signatures as the threshold for initiating that conversation. The petition filled steadily, driven not by any single viral moment, but by the consistent trickle of people who searched for Morton online, found the campaign, and signed because signing was the only available form of response to a loss that had never been formally acknowledged. Conagra did not respond publicly. No trial reintroduction was announced. No licensing agreement was floated. The brand remained discontinued, the formula unrevived, the Crozet plant still closed and repurposed, its decades of institutional knowledge still dispersed among the former workers who had carried it out the door when the facility shut down in 2000. What does it mean for the people who grew up with a brand when the company that owns it has never once tasted what made it worth keeping? The Morton story did not end with Conagra's silence. It shifted into the longer, quieter work of preservation, the kind that happens when official channels fail and communities take responsibility for their own history. In Albemarle County, discussions emerged around historical recognition for the Crozet plant, a marker, a plaque, a temporary exhibit that would document what the facility had meant to the community and what the brand had meant to the country. The Crozet Gazette covered the revival effort with the seriousness of a community newspaper, reporting on something that mattered to its readers because it had shaped the town they lived in. Brandland USA maintained its Morton coverage as one of the site's most consistently visited archives, a destination for the ongoing stream of people who found their way to it through searches that began with a memory and ended with the discovery that the memory was widely shared. The broader lesson that Morton's Ark offered to the American food industry was not subtle, though it was consistently ignored in the decades that followed. A brand built on genuine consumer loyalty, the kind of loyalty that produces Christmas morning traditions and grandmother rituals and fathers warming honey buns at 5 in the morning for children who woke up to meet them, cannot be valued accurately by the metrics that conglomerates use to evaluate portfolio holdings. Velocity numbers and margin profiles and SKU redundancy analyses do not capture what it means to be the product that a family reaches for automatically, without comparison shopping, without persuasion, simply because it has been part of how the household works for 20 years. That kind of relationship is not created by marketing investment, which means it does not disappear when marketing investment is withdrawn. It persists stubbornly and specifically in the memories of the people who held it. It persists long after the product is gone. It persists, in Morton's case, well into the second decade of the 21st century, driving internet searches and petition signatures and comment threads that read like letters to something that cannot write back. The economic impact on Crozet was not abstract. Albemarle County's largest employer had closed. The workers who had filled the plant's shifts, some of them second-generation Morton employees, some of them people who had spent their entire working lives inside that facility, had to find other work in a region that did not have an obvious replacement for what the plant had provided. The town did not collapse. Communities rarely collapse from a single economic loss, however significant. But the texture of the place changed. The industry that had defined Crozet's working identity since 1953 was gone, and what replaced it was the slower, less concentrated work of diversifying an economy that had been built around a single anchor. What Morton left behind in Crozet was not just unemployment statistics. It was a gap in the community's sense of itself. The kind of gap that a historical marker or a museum exhibit can acknowledge but cannot fill. The plant had been where people's parents worked, where the town's prosperity had been manufactured, box by box, truck by truck, across nearly 5 decades of American history. Its absence was felt not just economically, but in the way that the loss of a shared institution is always felt, as a diminishment of something that had made the place specific, that had given it a story to tell about itself that was different from every other small town in the Virginia foothills. That story deserved to be told. The people who had lived it deserved to have it acknowledged. And the families across the country who had eaten what those workers made, who had warmed those honey buns in those ovens on those cold mornings, deserved to know that what they remembered was real, that it had been worth exactly what they thought it was worth, and that its disappearance was a loss large enough to name. Go back to the freezer one more time. It is a winter morning, the specific kind where the sky is still dark at 6:30 and the house is cold enough that the furnace has been running since before anyone woke up. The kitchen linoleum is cool underfoot. The freezer door opens with that particular resistance, the rubber seal releasing, the cold air falling out against bare ankles. The box is light in both hands. 4 honey buns visible through the cellophane window, their white glaze catching the kitchen light. Frozen solid, pressed together, a brick of something sweet waiting to become something warm. The oven dial turns, the box opens. The 4 buns slide onto the tray, still locked together. Still cold, still that particular shade of crystallized white that will not survive the next 20 minutes. The oven door closes, and then there is nothing to do but wait. The smell arrives before any visual change is visible. First faint, a suggestion of warmth, a hint of yeast activating in the heat. Then fuller, rounder, filling the kitchen the way that particular combination of baking dough and caramelizing sugar fills a space. Not aggressively, not sharply, but completely the way a good smell occupies a room until the room belongs to it. The sky outside the kitchen window is beginning to lighten at the edges. The furnace has cycled off. The house is quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet before the people inside them have fully committed to being awake. The timer goes off. The oven door opens. The four buns have separated now. The frozen bond dissolved by 20 minutes of heat, each one sitting independently on the tray with its glaze amber and soft and still moving slightly at the edges. The butter goes on immediately. A full pat placed directly on top where it meets the warm glaze and begins its slow dissolution, running in thin golden lines down the curved sides of the bun, pooling at the base where the dough meets the tray. The first bite is too soon and the right time simultaneously. The glaze burns the roof of the mouth slightly. Nobody waits. That was Morton. That specific sequence, in that specific order, producing that specific result. Not an approximation of it, not a product in the same general category. That. It is worth sitting with what that actually meant. Not as a food product evaluated by its ingredients or its nutritional profile or its position in a corporate portfolio, but as an experience that lived inside the daily rhythm of American family life for 3 decades and performed a function that no spreadsheet has ever been designed to measure. Morton Frozen. Honey buns were not luxury food. They were not aspirational food. They were not the kind of thing that appeared in food magazines or earned mentions in restaurant reviews or became the subject of culinary nostalgia among people who considered themselves serious about what they ate. They were working-class food made for working-class mornings, bought by people who needed something good and reliable and affordable and warm, and who found in that box a solution that also happened to be a pleasure. That combination, of practical and pleasurable simultaneously, asking nothing of the person eating it except the willingness to turn on an oven and wait, is rarer than it sounds. Most food that is practical is not particularly pleasurable. Most food that is pleasurable is not particularly practical. Morton managed both, quietly and consistently, for long enough that millions of people stopped noticing it as a choice and started experiencing it as a given. What they provided cannot be separated from when they provided it. A father home from an overnight shift at 6 in the morning, warming honey buns while the house slept, sharing them with a child who woke to the smell. That is not a transaction. That is a moment of care made possible by the existence of something good in the freezer. A grandmother who kept the box stocked as a standing treat, whose kitchen became associated in her grandchildren's memories with that specific warmth and sweetness. That is not brand loyalty. That is the way that a reliable pleasure becomes attached to a person in a place, and eventually to a whole era of life that cannot be revisited. The honey buns were the vehicle. What they carried was the morning and the person who made it, in the feeling of being young in a house where someone had thought to put something good in the freezer for you. No replacement has occupied that position. Not because nothing is as good. There are honey buns available today that are perfectly adequate, some of them quite good, none of them requiring an oven. But adequacy is not the point. The point is the accumulated weight of repetition of a product experienced on enough mornings, in enough kitchens across enough years, that it became woven into the fabric of how a family worked. That weight cannot be transferred. It cannot be replicated by a successor product, however well formulated. It lives in the people who carry it, in the specific sensory details they retain, with a precision that is not diminished in 25 years, and it ends when they end. Which is why the story of Morton Frozen Honey Buns is worth telling with the seriousness it deserves. Not because a frozen bakery product was discontinued. Products are discontinued every year, and most of them leave without a trace. But because this one was real in a way that real things rarely get acknowledged as being real. It was made by hand, in a specific place, by people who spent their working lives inside a plant in the Virginia foothill that became the economic center of a small town, and the production anchor of a brand that Americans trusted for nearly half a century. It was carried to grocery stores by sales representatives who knew their accounts by name. It was bought by families who did not think of themselves as making a meaningful choice when they put it in the cart. They were simply reaching for what was always there, and it was eaten on ordinary mornings that became, in retrospect, extraordinary. Not because of anything dramatic that happened on those mornings, but because of what was warm on the counter when they started. Harold Morton deserves to be remembered. The man who began in a church basement in Louisville in 1938 with a chicken and noodle dish in glass jars, who built something from nothing through a combination of instinct and persistence and genuine belief that American families deserve food worth eating, he deserves acknowledgement for what he set in motion. Gene D. Patton, who helped him build it, deserves acknowledgement. The workers who ran the Crozet plant through its nearly 50 years of operation, who arrived before dawn and loaded the trucks and maintained the equipment and carried the institutional knowledge of how to make something millions of people loved, they deserve acknowledgement. The sales representatives who drove those boxes to every Kroger and Winn-Dixie they could reach, who built the retail relationships that kept Morton on the shelf through decades of corporate ownership changes, deserve acknowledgement. And the families who bought the boxes, who made the ritual, who handed it from parents to children and found in the repetition something that felt like permanence, they deserve acknowledgement most of all, because they are the ones still carrying it. Somewhere tonight, someone is trying to describe a Morton honey bun to a person who has never had one. They are trying to explain the glaze, the way it looked coming out of the oven, the way the butter disappeared into it, the way the kitchen smelled at 6:30 on a winter morning when the sky was still dark and there was nothing yet required of the day. The person listening has never tasted it, but from the way it is being described, from the specificity of the details, from the particular quality of attention being paid to something that was just a frozen pastry in a cardboard box, they understand that what is being described is not really the food. What is being described is a morning, a kitchen, a person who is no longer here, or a version of oneself that no longer exists, or a time in a life when the world was small enough that a warm honey bun on a cold morning was sufficient proof that things were going to be all right. Morton made that possible for 30 years in freezer cases across this country. They made it possible every single week. That is not nothing. That is, in the specific and unrepeatable way that the best ordinary things always are, everything.